So welcome everybody to the Computer Science Week at South Portland High School. Today's guest speaker is Chris St. Alban.
Next.
Oh, you're Brendan. Oh yes, we have Brendan D. Travis from Brook Consulting. Brendan D. Travis is the VP for Business Development at Brook Consulting. Brendan is a cybersecurity professional bringing over 20 years of experience in security, risk, and compliance focused on highly regulated industry verticals. Serving primarily in a client-facing capacity, he builds cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams in order to achieve compliance objectives and, more importantly, mitigate cybersecurity risk. He is certified in the Risk and Information System Controls, CRISC, is a certified Information Security Manager, CISM, and holds an MBA from Clarkson University. In his spare time, you will find Brendan with his family, somewhere in Casco Bay, or for various South Portland extracurricular programs. Go right.
That's right. Thank you. Morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Am I projecting?
Oh, yeah.
Thumbs up? Yeah. I know the speakers aren't working. So thank you for having me this morning. Again, my name is Brendan Travis. I am a consultant, I guess you could call it. Actually, I work with a firm called Brook Consulting. We're based out of Kennebunk, down south, as well as we have an office up in Pineland in New Gloucester. I actually just started with this firm in October, so I'm still kind of getting my feet wet, but as Lorenzo, right? As Lorenzo mentioned, I've been working in cybersecurity, risk, and compliance for the last 20 years. So I've been at this a while, and really excited to talk to this group here today. I've got some history with South Portland. My parents actually graduated from South Portland High back in the early 60s. I've got a couple kids in the school system right now, and figured it was a good opportunity to talk to you guys and really, hopefully, find out what is on your mind when it comes to cybersecurity. You know, I know it's Computer Science Week, and I'd like to draw a distinction between cybersecurity versus computer science. They are related, or information technology, right? But there are different disciplines involved and different areas of focus. So maybe that might be something new to you guys. I'm assuming a lot of you probably think that this is all technology-specific stuff. And I don't want to minimize that because a lot of it is heavy on technology and you know, computer information systems, networking, etc. But that's not the be-all, end-all, right? So I don't have a formal presentation prepared for you guys, so I'd like to hopefully have this interactive. You guys can throw questions at me anyway along the way as we kind of work our way through this conversation. As I understand it, this seminar, or this class in particular, is talking about career advancement and how to gain some skills in this capacity. So I'm going to kind of start with, I guess, a little bit of background on how I got into this field in general, because, quite honestly, when I was your age, this didn't even exist. It wasn't even a thing. So I'd be lying to you if I told you I had this passion for cybersecurity when I, all the way back to high school, because it just wasn't a thing. Which is interesting, because you never know sort of the twists and turns in your career is going to take you. You might have a passion for technology and computer science, and that's great, right? I mean, that will certainly open some doors for you, but there's so many different areas you can pursue, just knowing that right out of the gate. I talked to actually one of my friends from high school yesterday. I saw her, she was walking around past my house, and we hadn't caught up in a while. She was actually going for an interview later in the day. She's in healthcare, was talking about, preparing for that interview, and she's like, what do you do? I said, I work in, I'm in sales, right? So I'm in cybersecurity, but I'm on the sales side of the house, so I'm working at like a client-facing capacity. I talk to people, I sell people. I sell expertise, I sell knowledge, I sell know-how and how to overcome challenges, organizational challenges. And that's, when I mentioned that to her, she said, oh, so you're selling humans, you're human trafficking. And I said, well, no, we don't quite call it that. It's not human trafficking. But it's kind of similar in that capacity because, again, I am selling people. We provide professional services, which is essentially consulting. Right, so a lot of people think again of cybersecurity as a pure technology play. Oh, you're talking about antivirus, or you're talking about encryption, or you're talking about backups and all these different tools, right, that are part of cybersecurity, and those are bigger pieces. But it's much more broader than that because it really encompasses a few different disciplines that relate to people and relate to process, in addition to technology, right? So backing up a little bit, I came, and I'm going to date myself here, my first job out of college was back in 1999, forever ago at this point. And when I came into the workforce, show of hands, how many of you guys are familiar with what this concept known as Y2K? All right, a few of you. Right, so the whole notion behind Y2K was when the calendar flipped from 99 to 2000, the computer systems that were set up, right, they weren't structured to account for the transition from, everything was hard-coded 19X, right, 1981 to, through 1999. So when that calendar flipped to 2000, there was this whole industry in fear around what might happen when all these computer systems try to flip to 2000. What's going to happen? Can they do it? Are they going to malfunction? And there was all this concern around, anything that had computer systems tied to it, like an elevator or an escalator or air traffic control, all these critical functions in day-to-day, emergency services, ambulances, and critical care, and all this stuff. What's going to happen when the calendar flips? And of course, the day came and went, and what happened? Nothing really happened. I mean, the computers flipped as they needed to, and lo and behold, there was this whole hysteria around Y2K, and the reality is that nothing happened as a result. So that's kind of a common concept in cybersecurity, is this concept around what we call FUD factors, FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Because those are really motivational factors when it comes to the human psyche around motivating behavior, right? And driving investment and making money, really, right? There was a big money model behind this whole Y2K hysteria. But, so that was, again, in '99, and from there, again, cybersecurity wasn't a thing. When I came out of school, I had a general business degree, right? I went to undergraduate, didn't know what I was going to do when I was an undergrad, had an exploratory major my first year just because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that, I should probably get a degree and try to make leverage it in some capacity and try to get a decent, well-paying job, right? Allowed me to have some flexibility, hopefully, in my work schedule. Those things were important. So how do I do that? Well, I didn't really know. So I got a general business degree. Took generalized courses, liberal arts, education is where I focused. And, quite honestly, if you're thinking about, or you might be questioning yourselves, right? Where am I going to go to school? How am I going to focus? What's important to me? I mean, again, I didn't have any of those answers when I was your age. And so that just kind of led me down this path. Well, I'll just go to school and see what I see and maybe kind of go from there. And so I went through undergrad, got my bachelor degree, and still didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. So made the decision right out of school to go to a year of graduate school. My undergrad school had a program with a sister school that was based in New York, Clarkson University. Could get my MBA in a year, so I did that. It was great financially because I didn't have the cost of a 2-year program. Could do it relatively quickly, but so that came and went, and again, I had all this education in my back pocket, but I didn't have any real world experience, outside of a few, some internships and some summer jobs here and there. I didn't really have anything to fall on from work experience, which is pretty highly valued out there. I mean, if you want to get something, we all have to put our time in, right? Pay our dues, get into an entry-level position somewhere, and that's going to that is what it is, right? I mean, you gotta take advantage of what's in front of you. But from there, it's really a matter of how do I position myself so that I'm going to provide a career advancement, right? How am I going to get the path toward career advancement? So I took a job with a compliance firm in the banking industry right out of school. So we sold compliance software for banking. It's not exotic stuff, right? Banking compliance, it's like, what are we talking about here? But when you dug a little bit deeper, the compliance regulations we were providing software for banks was all around fair lending and what was called the Community Reinvestment Act, right? So these are regulatory drivers that were put in there by Congress to say to banks, listen, if you're going to be taking money from communities, right? You're serving a community, Bangor Savings Bank, Stockholm, Bedford, pick a bank. If you're going to be taking deposits from those communities, you actually have to lend out credit and bring money back to your constituents. Whoever's putting money into your system, you then have to serve that community in such a way that you're not skirting the rules, right? And when I say skirting the rules, banks back in the day, they would essentially look at low and moderate income tracts. So where is the population, where do they live, right, that are low and moderate income population. And they would essentially draw a red line around those areas of community, and they would say, these guys are too risky. If we lend them or extend them any credit, what are the chances we're going to get repaid? So they literally mark those areas off and decide not to lend credit to those areas, which just continually perpetuates this marginalized sort of environment where those communities can never get ahead because they're never given the opportunity, right, to take advantage of credit, which is essential for all of us, right? I mean, if you're going to make any big investment, you're probably going to have to take on some debt. So in any event, that was, that was important to me just because I thought, well, that's, we're doing good for the community by selling these software pieces to, hopefully make an impact on people's lives, right? So, and that's important as you kind of, again, figure out what you want to do. Hopefully there's some purpose behind your work and your activity. There's something that gives you, you're passionate about to a degree, right? I mean, that is, it makes it a lot easier to get out of bed every day and go to work when you know that work that you're doing is meaningful and impactful. So, again, something to consider there. But, again, during that time frame, this was the early 2000s, cybersecurity was still in its infancy. So, back then, I remember there were a couple different, like, viruses and worms and Trojans. If those are terms you're familiar with, you guys probably are. But, those were starting to come on the scene, right? So there was a virus called, I think, I Love You virus, which is essentially was, these mail forwarding sort of operations where you get some spam email and you forward it on to however many people and you get, some incentive, there was some monetary incentive behind it, which was all a scam. But, at this time, people weren't really skeptical around what these things were and, weren't really knowledgeable around what the purpose was behind it. But the viruses at the time, they didn't really have a huge, they were a nuisance, right? You click on a link, you get a virus, you get a blue screen, right? The blue screen of death is what we called it back in the day, where essentially you had to reboot your computer, right? It might be slow, it might affect performance, but at the end of the day, it was a nuisance, right? It was a pain in the butt, no big deal. But so that was the beginning of what has turned out to be a much more aggressive and impactful threat environment, right? So from there, fast forward a few years, 2007. Who's familiar with a virus called Stuxnet? Name ring a bell? What was it? Remember? Say it again? Keep hearing. Stuxnet. It was, so this was back in 2007, and essentially what happened is, again, that the perpetrator who released this virus still has not been identified, although it's widely believed this virus was developed and put out in the wild by the United States government. And so what they did is essentially they unleashed that virus on Iran. right? Iran, and we're still dealing with Iran as far as their nuclear capabilities. What this virus did is it manipulated the code that are part of their centrifuges. So these machines that were spinning around and had to, have certain code embedded in this nuclear environment, this manufacturing environment, they were trying to develop a nuclear capability. And these centrifuges, essentially, the virus switched the code so that the timing of the spinning of those centrifuges was thrown off to a degree, and essentially broke these centrifuges for the Iran's nuclear capability. And it set them back years, set them back several years from advancing that capability. But at the same time, now it's sort of the genie's out of the bottle, right? I mean, this virus was thrown out there in the wild, and of course, it achieved, I guess, that short-term objective of the United States government slowing down Iran's nuclear capability, but at the same time, that virus now could be manipulated and leveraged by bad actors, right? And other folks that are able to reverse engineer what that virus was and use it for their own nefarious purposes, right? So that was 2007. And from there, I guess the impact of viruses in general contributed largely to a lot of costs involved from things like ransomware, right? So, you talk about a virus that might land on your machine. What payload is it going to drop, right? So what's it going to do? Does it have a keylogger, so it's looking at your keystrokes? It has a screen scraper, so it just takes pictures of your screen? Does it have a credential harvester, where it's trying to get credentials to sensitive assets, like think of your bank account, think of your benefits plan or insurance or anything like this, right? You probably don't want people to be able to log into your bank account and do what they will, right? So, those were all, I guess, concerns, obviously, but what's really had a major impact recently is ransomware, right? So, essentially, anyone familiar with ransomware want to take a stab at what it does?
Yeah, so from what I remember, ransomware, it holds all your data hostage, and it can, ask for them to pay for it, and if you do not pay, you'll either delete it or send it around. I remember actually had that happen, where they used all the data of their account details. I remember at one point, they the children also got ransomware, but they reversed it after realizing it was.
Yep, excellent, very, very well said. So, an extortion scheme, right? So, you get ransomware on your organization's computer, your own computer at home. Essentially what that does is it encrypts the information on your computer so that you can't use it, you can't open it, you can't delete it, you can't do anything with it, it's locked down. And in order to get access to it, there's a decryption key, right? So these perpetrators will essentially hold your data hostage in exchange for a ransom payment. And those ransom payments are pretty significant, right? 6 digits, 7 digits, I mean, it's a lot of money. So, very effective tool for a lot of bad actors and perpetrators out there that are oftentimes, part of the big challenge was sort of enforcing or policing this sort of activity, is the fact that a lot of these perpetrators reside overseas. So think North Korea, Russia, the Eastern Europe bloc, China, right? They are maybe not the government themselves that are doing this, but oftentimes they're sponsored through a government that looks the other way and says, we know you're doing all this stuff, but we really don't care, because you're hurting an enemy of ours. In this case, a lot of the Western countries that have a big part to play in terms of our global financial infrastructure. So, you mentioned Ashland Madison, right? So that was a dating website, right? I mean, there was, that was information that you didn't want, if you were a subscriber to that service, and I think that, that was it wasn't something you would want to get out there in the public. You were probably doing that.
Please pardon the interruption. Cameron Swatter, please come to the front office. Cameron Swatter, please come to the front office.
So we talked about ransomware. So I guess where was I going with this? I'm trying to, because there's, in terms of the evolution, right, around cybercrime, cyber security in general, I mean, it's very dynamic in the sense that there's the external threat environment's always changing. So there's different techniques and tactics that the bad guys are bringing to the table that essentially means the people on defense, right, the cyber experts like the company I represent and obviously organizations that are under this threat, they've got to constantly up their game to account for these new threats that are out there. So, we're talking about not only, again, knowing what technology tools to deploy, but a lot of these threats take advantage of people's and manipulate people's emotions and basic instincts. So who's familiar with social engineering? That term in general, a few of you. So social engineering is the art of manipulating humans for nefarious benefit. And that's done through, we've all gotten emails that are not legitimate and are looking, there's, I think it goes back to fraudulent schemes. The Nigerian prince fraudulent scheme that was well known probably a decade or so ago, where you get an email saying, listen, I've got all this money for you, but in order to do it, please send me however many dollars, and here's your reward that you're going to get out of it. And obviously, it was a scam, in that these scamming techniques have been going on for forever, right? Since the dawn of the day, way back when. But they've gotten certainly more sophisticated now, and I think what's important for you guys, where we are, I really think we're on a precipice around the distortion of reality in our society in general, and what that means for, in this context of cybercrime and cybersecurity, because you talk about things like artificial intelligence, you talk about things like machine learning and deep fakes and virtual reality, and it's almost hard to decipher what is legitimate and what's illegitimate, right? And that is obviously something that's concerning for anyone, but certainly if you're part of an organization that is looking to meet their customer needs, but at the same time make sure that they're conducting business in a legitimate fashion. If they know that people are after their sensitive information or financial information for bad purposes, that makes it extremely difficult. And I just think that we're at a point now where we are we're on the verge of something that I think could have significant ramifications. Just again, with respect to artificial intelligence in particular, just in the last year or so, that has exploded with, not only ChatGPT, but all of the different AI engines out there, and what are called large learning models, LLMs, and data lakes, and all these different terms that are out there that really are concerning, but on the other hand, provide an opportunity for you guys, right? I guess I'm going to take a couple steps back here. When cybersecurity was originally introduced as sort of a concept that businesses had to deal with, businesses typically were resistant to it. And why were they resistant to it? Because it's an additional expense, right? They didn't really view it as a revenue-generating investment. They thought of it as an insurance plan, right? So you're essentially insuring yourself that if something bad happens, you can mitigate the likelihood that something, you're going to be impacted negatively, right? So that is, essentially they were saying, we're not going to make those investments because, it's not going to generate any revenue for us, and we're just going to roll the dice, right? And that contributes to one of the myths. There's a lot of myths in cybersecurity.
How do you describe how would you describe your working day, as you said?
My working day?
Yeah.
It depends on the day, which is nice, right? So it's not routine, it's not consistent, but right now, anyway, I am doing a lot of research as far as building up a go-to-market plans to essentially say, okay, who do we want to sell to and how do we want to promote our services to which communities? But I guess an important part of that and where I was going with this sort of reluctance or resistance for a lot of organizations to invest in cybersecurity is, the government stepped in and said, at the early part of the 2000s, part of what was called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, also known as the Financial Services Modernization Act. This was back in 1999. So Congress stepped in and essentially said, well, we can't leave it up to you to say, okay, we're going to make these investments in cybersecurity, and we're going to do the right thing and protect our customers' information. Right? We can't leave it up to you because you're not doing it all or you're not doing it effectively. So essentially they came in and said, we're going to mandate that you make a minimum amount of investment to make sure that our critical infrastructure is secure and protected. Right? So that started with financial services. Right? Think about, if the integrity of our financial services model were disrupted, or you couldn't get money out of the bank, or your money was never a given, right? Think of the impact that would have. We couldn't conduct commerce. It would have significant ramifications. So the government obviously decided, well, that's a threat we just can't stomach, right? So we're going to mandate that you do this. And now, you get into this debate and divide around regulation, and is it too much regulation? Is it not enough? And, the political, debate enters into that conversation. But in this circumstance, I think across all the different lines of politics, there was a recognition that this is too risky. We can't have our financial system be part of a meltdown of sorts, right? And that extends to other critical infrastructure. Think about like healthcare, and the HIPAA Act, the Health Insurance Protection Accountability Act, I think is what it was called. HIPAA is all around EPHI, electronic protected health information, right? Making sure that information is secure, so people can't manipulate that information and do nefarious things with it. And I want to stress that a lot of what I'm talking about now is specific to information that is obviously of a sensitive nature, but it's not only information, it's also protecting about availability of systems, right? So think about, again, if you're in the hospital and you've got a critical, heart monitor or something, a defibrillator or something that is running obviously in electronic fashion, and that is shut off for some reason because you've been negatively impacted, there's been a virus or something, that means you're not getting critical care. Right? And think about the ramifications that could have. Certainly in like an intensive care unit or something like that. So these regulations have been pushed out to other critical infrastructure. So think about healthcare, financial services, the energy sector, utilities, right? The electrical grid. That has to be secure. We need electricity. We need heat. We need all these things. Our basic needs need to be met. Right? So again, the government has stepped in historically to make that happen. So I'm just trying to give you some background around this, I guess, area in general, or this specialty of cybersecurity. I will say that, again, it is a sort of a niche relative to what people might traditionally think of information technology. Information technology is obviously the focus there is making sure you've got network environments that are available and performing and operating in a manner that's going to achieve their objectives. That is separate and distinct from securing that technology, right? There's a principle in our world called segregation of duties, right? Which essentially means if you're going to be responsible for maintaining a network environment and make sure it's performing and operating on a regular basis, you should not also have the responsibility for securing that environment. There should be some separation and some oversight, right? Because sometimes those come into conflict with each other. So they can't, you kind of have to separate those two. It doesn't always happen, right? A lot of organizations will blend the two and just, look the other way. But that's an important principle. So let me step back for a minute. Any questions? Anything I've mentioned thus far generated questions from Anyone? Where is it?
You know how you said you work in the client-facing portion where you give out information. It's also like how you build the cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams. How do you structure that? Are they all have the same skills, or do they have separate skills to put in a team so they can work thinking on an objective?
Yeah, great question, great question. So no, they don't all have the same skills, right? So the question was, if you guys didn't hear it from Lorenzo, in my job now, how do I build cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams, right, when I'm selling these services? Because oftentimes I'll be working with, like the first person I might talk to is probably going to be part of IT, right? So they've got a specific area of focus, like we mentioned, keeping these networks operating, up and running, etc. But what they're missing, what they don't always have, is context around the business requirements. So think about the other functional areas of any business. You've got IT, you also have finance, you have operations, you've got legal, you've got audit maybe, you've got all these other disciplines that are all working together, customer service, to essentially accomplish the organization's mission, right? So you've got a constituency, a set of clients that you're serving. How do we make sure we're serving those clients effectively and reliably, right? Which is where we're talking about here, how this question comes into play. So, a lot of times there may be, the IT group may be resistant to some of the controls that are suggested by my team, simply because they're too cost prohibitive, right? They might be too costly. They might be too complicated to implement. They might not have the resources to do it, so they need additional support. And that support might come from executive leadership. But this goes back to why are they even having this conversation? Is it do they have to satisfy a regulatory requirement? And if so, that's where compliance comes into the mix. There might be a compliance team that needs to be part of that conversation. And then it's a matter of saying, well, how do we essentially again serve our clients in a manner that's going to take into account the business requirements of all these different departments, right? Because you think about it, you make a change, like take for example multi-factor authentication, right? You guys familiar with that, MFA? Yeah. So that's a control, right, where you put in your username and password to get access to an application, and they say, go to a separate, they might send you a text, they might ask you to go to another authenticated app to say, put this number in, and essentially it's an out-of-band level of authentication, right? So how do we know that you are who you are when you're simply putting in username and password, right? Those can be compromised. So it's something you have on you, right? They'll give you a call, they'll send you a text, they'll ask you to go to a separate resource so they know that, again, you are who you say you are. The reason I bring it up is because if you're going to implement something like that without, I guess, awareness and understanding and buy-in at an organizational level that this is coming down the line, like you might have people, it depends on the business, but think about people in the field that need access to information immediately to make a decision or to drive a sale or whatever it might be. If they all of a sudden have this restrictive control in place and they weren't even aware about it, that's going to cause problems, right? It's going to impact revenue, and it's going to create frustration organization-wide. So the reason I bring that up is just because it's important to understand why you might be considering adopting some of these controls and who needs to be part of that conversation. So it's a lot of fact-finding. It's a lot of educating. I think a lot of times, people are intimidated by this subject matter. They might find it overwhelming. They think it's, again, purely technology. And again, a lot of it is technology, but a lot of it is a conversation about risk, right? Because it's, we talked about social engineering, but a lot of these bad things happen because of maybe not malicious intent, but because of accidental happenstance, right? You leave a laptop at your friend's house or on the bus or whatever. Okay, well now someone can pick it up and essentially do what they want with it. Is there anything sensitive on that laptop? what can happen as a result of the fact that you left a laptop on the bus. So a lot of these things are not specifically attributed to malicious intent. A lot of it is accidental. That's just one of the myths that are predominant in this industry, is that it's all, these activities only happen to large organizations, right? That's another one, and that's a fallacy. I mean, large organizations typically, yeah, they have a much broader footprint, but at the same time, they have a lot of resources to throw at cybersecurity. So they've probably got some effective systems in place and have implemented a lot of controls, which is all well and good. They're not ironclad. They're not, 100%. Nothing is. There's no guarantee in cybersecurity. That's another thing that, again, you can't eliminate risk. You can mitigate risk, but you can't eliminate it unless you avoid it, unless you step out of business. I mean, if you're in business, you're accepting some risks. So how do we make sure that we're, again, conducting ourselves responsibly? Did I answer your question?
Do you use any languages like Python, like Java, or something else?
Personally, no. I mean, so that would be kind of on the programming side of that. Now I will say some of our technical services team, pen testers, are any of you familiar with penetration testing? Does that ring a bell? One of you? So that's a particular, we're ethical hackers, right? So essentially firms will hire my company to break into, to try to manipulate and break into hacker system, right? From the so we'll just, based on their IP ranges, so all the public-facing IP ranges that this organization is putting out there. And when I say putting out there, think about websites, think about things like VPNs, virtual private network, think about things like RDP, remote desktop protocol, things like file transfer, secure file transfer. These are all services that are public-facing, meaning that, anyone at a computer terminal can access that service. Now, just because they can access it, can they actually use it? No, not if you're legitimate and have credentials and everything else, but there might very well be exposures in that code, right? Whatever that service is providing, there could be ways to manipulate that code in order for a hacker to gain access into that network. And then once you get access to the internal network, you're kind of off to the races. You can kind of maneuver and get around to an internal network environment, to a database, let's say, that has sensitive information, right? That they could use for their own advantage. So, yeah, I don't personally work with those computer languages, but certainly they're part of this whole conversation.
Do you ever think like AI will be used in the cyber attacks, like social engineering?
It already is. Yep, it already is. Adversarial AI engines are certainly out there, and yeah, that's part of the challenge, and really I think it's going to be certainly leveraged to a greater degree as these AI engines get more sophisticated and more mature. And then again, this just goes back to manipulating reality and trying to distinguish what's legitimate versus what isn't. Which this concept of fighting AI with AI. So you've got this, that's this adversarial AI. So these AI models, which are algorithms and data lakes, essentially saying, okay, I'm going to learn what the right responses are for any question that you put in there, and I'll be able to feed you an answer. Well, you might have another adversarial artificial intelligence engine essentially trying to manipulate that by feeding that engine bad data, right? So it's almost like they cancel each other out at that point, but I mean, we're a little bit a ways from that, I guess, getting to a level where it might be, have a significant impact, but it's definitely here already.
So where do you think like cybersecurity would be like 2030?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. Still around, let me put it that way. I mean, it's never going, this challenge, this problem is never going away. Which is, again, if this is something that's of interest to you guys, this is a definite career path that you might want to pursue, or if you have any interest in it at all, there's going to be a market for certainly folks like you who are digital natives, right? You've all grown up with technology and are comfortable and familiar with it. My generation, not as much so, but certainly with you guys, I mean, this is going to be something that there's always going to be a demand and a need, certainly for that time around. Yeah.
What do you think are the most effective techniques? I remember there was a leak on a Rockstar Games, which was like $1 billion worth, and it was solely by social engineering. Do you think there's anything like more like that? Or?
Well, so typically, what's the percentage? 90 some odd percent of all compromises and breaches involve some form of social engineering. Right? So this human element, this human aspect of how these compromises are realized and take shape almost always involves a human. So you think about that, you guys are constantly trying to be manipulated. And think about people in customer support or service centers for an organization. I mean, their level of trust and willingness, that's their job, is to support the customer. So it's almost antithetical or adversarial for them to, kind of put the brakes on and be skeptical and constantly question and things of that nature. The bad guys are constantly taking advantage. They know that that's the case. So they're constantly trying to manipulate that reality and that trust factor. There's this concept called zero trust in this industry, which is essentially, you don't trust anything, you always verify it, right? So trust but verify is another concept that's well known. Just because we've gotten to a point here, as far as this challenge maturing to the point that you can't really credentials can't necessarily be trusted. That's why we've got MFA, right? You've got another factor that you can hopefully account for that trust factor. I caught like half of that. Help me out. One more time. Yeah. Short answer is yes. So the question was the average time for organizations to discover that they've been breached is 200 and some odd days, did you say? 200, right? So is there any way that that can be reduced? Can we, obviously discover these breaches faster? So the short answer is yes. And the answer there is a mix of controls that allow you to determine that there's something awry, there's something out of place, there's something concerning going on in your environment. So I think that a big factor that goes into the fact that it takes organizations so long to determine that they've been breached is because they don't have controls in place. And what I mean by controls, again, they might have technology in play, but if you've got a bunch of systems that are throwing out alerts and just saying, there's something going on here, you might want to look at it, that requires a human, typically, someone to take that information and to take action. So there's this concept around false positives and what's white noise. I think there's fatigue in a lot of organizations just because there's so many technology controls in place that are throwing out alerts, and a lot of it isn't legitimate, but some of it is. And they might just sort of ignore it and say there's nothing to see here. But a lot of this goes into building a program around cybersecurity. So you've got not only the technology, but you've got people that can make sense of what those tools are telling them, and hopefully identify that there's something wrong, right, in a much quicker fashion. So, yeah, good question. And without a doubt, the answer is yes, but it's not easy, right? Just for the basic facts that I talked about earlier, a lot of organizations don't want to spend the time and effort to do it because they don't see that they're getting a return on it until they get breached, right? Once they get breached, the conversation changes. And it's interesting, you don't hear, you hear about breaches on a regular, right? It's in the news on a fairly frequent basis. But at the same time, we're only hearing a fraction of the actual number of breaches that happen because what organization wants to go out there and essentially announce to the world that they've been breached, right? You're only going to do that if you've got to make public disclosures. Essentially, you know, a certain number of client records were exposed. Now, okay, you've got to make these public disclosures to the people that were impacted by it, right? I mean, if it doesn't rise to that level, or if there's an unknown around the number of records that are exposed, why would an organization tell you they've been breached? I mean, it's not great press. It doesn't, you know, do them any good. So a lot of times, if they don't have to make that public, they won't. So we only hear a fraction, really, of what's going on there. You know, and just, I think what's important to illustrate, just as an example, so this was 3 years ago, a firm called SolarWinds is a big cybersecurity firm, well-known, adopted by large enterprise organizations on a global scale. So they provide software to detect incidents, so managed incident and response capability. So essentially, the whole reason that SolarWinds is in these organizations is to detect that there is an incident, they've been breached, or they've got a virus, or something is going on that they need to respond to. So what happens with SolarWinds is they were breached. SolarWinds was breached by, I think it got attributed to the Russians, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if it's been confirmed, but there's strong likelihood that the Russians were behind this attack. But essentially what happened was, you know, they were breached and they didn't know they had been breached, which the level of irony here is that this organization is in business to prevent exactly what happened to their own organization. And essentially what happened to them is their code was manipulated. So think about, you bring on a piece of software, right? That software gets updated every so often. You get software updates, download the latest software update. It's got new features, it's got security controls, whatever it might be. So their code was infiltrated by the Russians. And essentially once they sent out that update for all of their clients then downloaded exploited code that had essentially a backdoor for the Russians to get into all of their client environments. So who were some of their environments? Or I should say, who were some of their clients? No less than 9 government agencies. I think the Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy. I mean, this is our government. This is our government that was just breached by a third party, right? SolarWinds was the third party that they relied on. But this is at the upper echelons of our government that this has happened. And it's, you know, it's kind of mind-boggling, you know, because you don't think about the ramifications. It doesn't get, again, the press, I don't know. Our information cycle is so fast now that, you know, you're on to the next thing as soon as you hear about it. But the implications about something like that should be pretty startling. And it's why, and again, this is where, you know, in my opinion, we would benefit from additional regulations on certain, you know, organizations that, you know, are providing critical services. And in particular, like the next one to come down is through the Department of Defense. They are introducing regulations on the defense industrial base. So think about, you know, all the organizations out there that are, you know, providing parts to, like VIW, for building their warships or their destroyers, or submarine manufacturing, or rockets, or, you know, General Dynamics and their laser development, and all these different pieces of the manufacturing model to support the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is saying, my God, if we're relying on all these organizations to help us build our nation's defense infrastructure, we need to make sure that they haven't been manipulated or compromised. Right? And that's, I mean, just knowing, it's a huge challenge. So I just throw that out there, I guess, to highlight where we're at, I guess, currently. And that was 3 years ago now. But it's not getting any better. It's getting worse in terms of the bad actors and their ability to infiltrate and cause havoc, right? So, any other questions? Me?
Text, if anything in the program, the codes, like it's slightly off, it's always running, checking like almost daily or every hour, or something to code to make sure that this 8% of the company is updating the software data, grabbing the data from other company software, that are in code that shouldn't be there based on what the programming is writing?
So great question, right? Has there been consideration to developing any technology essentially out there that will review code, any programming code that's under development, to look for inconsistencies and exposures and potentially malicious intent? So, that I know those tools do exist now. They're part, and are incorporated into the software development lifecycle for a lot of organizations that do write code, that do pursue software. Again, yet we're still seeing these breaches happen, right? So it's like, how can, there's a disconnect there, right? Is the technology that's set out there to identify these things, is it sophisticated enough? Is it not good enough? Or why is it not accomplishing that goal? And that, I don't have that answer for you off the top of my head, but I mean, you would think anyway that if there were these sort of checkpoints along the way, when you are writing code, and making sure that, again, if there are inconsistencies and exposures, that these technologies could point that out to you. But I will say that I think a lot of those technologies are not adopted because a lot of it goes back to cost. Right? That's just going to drive up our cost of development, and eat into our profit margins. And so they make the decision to say, well, we can probably live without that additional expense by maybe implementing some manual tools or processes. So I do know that technology exists, but how widely adopted it is, I guess, is probably up for debate. Gotcha.
What has been one of the most interesting cases that you've worked on?
Cases, well,
Or challenges?
let's see here. So I've been a part of some forensic investigations, right, from some breach responses where, and again, I'm typically in a sales capacity when I'm selling these services. I'm on the front end, so I'm typically looking for new organizations to obviously promote our services to, and to effectively bring on as a client. Once they're brought on as a client, I'm not as involved as I would be otherwise, but I have been a part of some apps, so some long-term clients that have been breached, and they've involved myself and some other stakeholders around this concept around incident response. And that's a big component of building a program, because I think I mentioned earlier that there's no guarantee in cyber. You can't eliminate everything. There's no 100%. All you can do is mitigate risk. So in the unfortunate event that something does happen and you are breached, well, you better have a plan around what you're going to do if that happens, right? So part of that is really defining criteria. How do we even know what set of criteria needs to be satisfied before we actually determine that we should call the incident response team together? And the incident response team is, typically, again, this multidisciplinary team. It's technology, it's compliance, it's legal, it's audit, it's finance. To say, my God, we think we've had a breach, we don't exactly know the extent of it, because there's so many unknowns, right? You don't want to raise alarm if it's not legitimate, but if it is legitimate, obviously, so there's this sort of fine line you're walking around, doing enough but not doing too much and causing concern. So, I mean, I've just been, and I can't name names, right? But, there's been organizations that have been down for, boy, I'd say about a week, and the number or the financial impact for that was in the millions of dollars, not just due to lost revenue, but all of the costs that go into bringing your network infrastructure back up, paying a ransom for that. So, those are certainly the most interesting ones. And then, outside of that, just, constantly hearing these more high-profile breaches like that SolarWinds breach I just mentioned, and, the highest levels of our government being impacted by it, I just think is staggering.
So we have a lot of students thinking about careers in the future. Do you have any advice for someone who's thinking of going into sales?
So I never really thought I'd get into a pure sales role. I mean, if anyone has an interest in selling, that's great, because it's not easy to do. I would say depending upon what you're selling, right? I mean, if you're going door to door, that's tough. I mean, you know, it's all about who your audience is and who you're trying to attract, and do they have a need, and all these things. So, you know, I've always taken the approach. Sales guys get a bad rap, right? They've got a reputation about them that, you know, they're dirty. They're just trying to. They're not, you know, being straight with you. They're trying to pull one over on you, or, you know, it's snake oil, or whatever it is. So, I have found selling, the effective way of selling is educating. Right? So if you become an expert at whatever you're trying to sell, and you are able to educate the people you're selling to, and leave it to them to draw their own conclusions, whether they buy from you or they buy from someone else. I mean, you know that they're going to probably have a need to buy from someone. So if you can equip them and provide them with something they didn't know beforehand, that's extremely effective. And you can, you know, essentially give them something without expecting anything in return, immediately anyway. That might be a good technique to take advantage of. You know, I will say, just in that context, and again, looking toward career development and where you think you're going to focus your time and energy, I'm a big advocate of a generalist's education, right, in the liberal arts fashion, because you're exposed to so many different areas and domains of interests anyway. I mean, God bless you if you've got, you know, a certain focus where you want to specialize on a specific skill. You know, that's great. I just know that I didn't have that in my arsenal. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So, you know, getting that exposure helps you relate to people. You know, getting that exposure in these different functional areas and educational areas allows you to develop, I think, a background so that you can effectively communicate to put people on the other side of the coin there. Yeah, when it comes to sales, I mean, it's all about knowing your audience. Who are you talking to? Right, and coming down to a functional role, like, is this someone in IT? Right, what are they motivated by? What are they being held accountable for?